there was a king. Before there were castles, before anyone had bothered inventing tea, there was only land. And dampness. The land that would one day be called England was not yet England. It was just a soggy, green patch of earth. It had rivers, hills, moss, and many, many confused animals wandering around. There were no roads, no houses, no boots, just mud, glorious, endless mud. People did live here, but not very many. They didn't have clocks or coins. They built mysterious circles out of giant stones, like Stonehenge. To this day, no one knows why. Maybe it was for ceremonies. Maybe it was for sleeping sheep. Maybe they were just very bored. But they took their time, dragging enormous rocks for miles, with no wheels, no horses, and definitely no coffee. That's patience. That's prehistoric England. Eventually, a few smarter folks floated over from the continent. They brought new things: farming, pottery, actual pants. These were the Celts, and they built tiny villages with round houses made of mud and straw. Their lives were quiet. They cooked porridge. They carved things. They probably argued about goats. And for a long time, nothing much happened, just wind, and sheep, and more rain, until one day someone else arrived and they brought roads. The wind was blowing across the hills. The sheep were chewing. The Celts were minding their own business. And then boats. Big wooden ones with sails and serious-looking soldiers inside. They came across the sea from a faraway place called Rome, where people wore togas, bathed in marble, and built things with alarming determination. The Romans had arrived, and they didn't ask politely. They marched ashore. They looked around. They saw the rain and the mud and the confused Celts with their painted faces, and they said, "Let's conquer it anyway." And so they did. They built roads, straight ones, very, very straight roads, because the Romans hated curves, apparently. They also built walls, like Hadrian's Wall across the top of Britain, not to keep people in, but to keep the Scottish out. They brought warm baths, and sandals, and wine, and slightly awkward statues. They called the land Britannia and made it part of the Roman Empire. They brought writing, coins, and taxes, because you can't have civilization without paperwork. For about 400 years, the Romans stayed. They made towns, villas, aqueducts, and quiet little temples. You see, Rome itself was falling apart. There were barbarians knocking at the gates, and Rome needed its soldiers back. So the Romans packed up their helmets, took their sandals, and went home. They left behind stone ruins, abandoned roads, and a lot of very confused Britons wondering where their warm baths went. And thus, the quiet began again. No more marching, no more Latin, just drizzle and sheep. But of course, the peace wouldn't last, because someone else was sailing in, again. The Romans had left, and with them they took their baths, their coins, and their slightly superior sandals. Britannia was quiet once again, too quiet, until new sails appeared on the horizon. This time it was not just one group, it was many. Trickling in, tribe by tribe, name by name, they were the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. From places now called Germany and Denmark, but back then just cold, foresty somewhere lands. They didn't march in loudly. They came slowly, in boats, with families, with goats, and possibly with cheese. They settled, built wooden halls, lit fires, and spoke in strange words that sounded nothing like Latin, more like coughing with purpose. They pushed the old Celtic Britons west into what would one day be called Wales, and in their place they began to shape a new land. They called it England, the land of the Angles, eventually just England. It wasn't one big kingdom. No, that would have been too simple. Instead, there were lots of little kingdoms. Wessex, Essex, Sussex, Mercia, Northumbria, and Socks were lost in the mud, probably forever. The kings had big beards, the queens had even bigger patience, and the scribes wrote things down very slowly. Still, they managed. They planted wheat, built wooden churches, learned to read a little, and started telling stories. Stories like Beowulf, where a brave hero fought a monster named Grendel, and then Grendel's mom. Because history is nothing without unexpected mothers. And for a while, it all worked. England, or the idea of England, was growing. But of course, it wouldn't last. Because somewhere across the sea, someone else was sharpening their axes, and they were about to knock, rather loudly, on England's wooden doors. The Anglo-Saxons were settling in. Fires were crackling in long halls. Cows were chewing gently in muddy fields. Things were peaceful, mostly. Until in the year 793, something changed. It began quietly, a boat or two. Strange sails, tall men with cloaks, shiny brooches, and rather pointy weapons. They came to a small island off the coast of Northumbria. The island was called Lindisfarne. There was a monastery there, full of monks, books, and silence. But the silence ended that day. The boats pulled up. The men jumped out. And suddenly the monks were not alone. The strangers weren't looking for conversation. They were looking for treasure, for gold, for silver, and maybe a bit of chaos. The monks didn't stand a chance. And just like that, the Viking Age had begun. The Vikings came from the north, from places now called Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Cold places, snowy places, places with more mountains than muffins. But in their longships they were fast, and fearless and curious. At first they raided, quick attacks, grab the gold, burn the church, sail away. Then they stayed, and settled, and farmed. In time, parts of England became known as the Danelaw lands where Viking law ruled, and everything probably smelled like fish and firewood. One king tried very hard to stop them. His name was Alfred. He was clever, calm, and possibly very tired. He built fortresses, wrote laws, encouraged learning, and maybe burned a few cakes once by accident, though that story might just be gossip. But Alfred slowed the Vikings down. And after Alfred, others tried too. Sometimes they fought, sometimes they made treaties, sometimes they just waited for winter to pass. Eventually, the Vikings began to mix in. They traded, they married, they told stories by the fire. And just like the Celts and the Romans, they became part of England's growing, muddy family. By now, England wasn't just a land. It was an idea. A messy, rainy, often invaded idea, but an idea all the same. And for a moment, the land breathed. Until a new shadow crossed the sea, with horses, with chainmail, and with a man who claimed he was the rightful king. By the year 1066, England was tired. It had been through Romans, Saxons, Vikings, and now it had a new king, Edward the Confessor. He was a quiet man, loved the church, loved praying. Possibly wasn't too interested in being king, but he wore the crown anyway. When Edward died, he left behind a kingdom,